Today we're going to be learning Yevamot daf Samach Aleph. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to start from the very bottom of Samach Amud Bet. Tanya. We're going to start with the Baitus. We were learning about Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and his opinion about women convert who converted under the age of 3 would not be disqualified to marry a kohen, meaning would be allowed to. So now we move to another halacha of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Another halacha which seemingly is a leniency, as opposed to other opinions that might be more strict about these things. That also have to do with gentiles, or at least a convert who was at some point a Gentile. The grave of a non-Jew or an idol worshiper is, why do I say it like that? Because sometimes idol worshippers just really mean any non-Jews. Sometimes they mean specifically those who worship idols. It's never really clear which is which, different opinions about it. Usually we just assume it means referring to just a Gentile. They're not mitame ohel. What does it mean to be mitame ohel? The Torah says, and this is going to be important to see later, Adam ki yamut ohel. If a person dies in a tent, then what it means is everything in the tent becomes impure. Likewise, a grave, anything above it, right? Like if, let's say, there's a roof coming over it. So, or I put myself kind of leaning over the grave. The tumah will go up and I will become impure, or everything under the roof, for example, is impure. So if I was under the roof, I will be impure. But not for the graves of Gentiles. Shenema v'atem tzonitzo mariti adam atem. In Yechezkel it says, "You're my flock of sheep. You're the ones I lead. Adam atem. You are Adam." That means when it says in the pasuk about ohel, Adam ki yamut ohel, the Jews are considered Adam, and atem kuyim Adam ve'en ovdei kochavim kuyim Adam. Gentiles are not considered. The word Adam does not refer to them. It doesn't mean Gentiles aren't humans. Of course, they're humans. What it means is when God calls the word Adam in the Torah, he means Adam, meaning Jews, and not meaning Gentiles. Okay, so again, it says no bearing on how we view Gentiles. It just means when the Torah uses the word Adam, the Torah means Jews. So is that true? Wait a minute. We're going to show a number of places where it says Adam, and it clearly means non-Jews. This is a list of the Midianites in the battle of the Midianim in Bamidbar, chapter 31. It's a battle with the Midianim, and we killed 16,000 people were killed from them. Adam was clearly referring to the Gentiles, the Midianim, who were killed. So they say mishum behema, because there was a list of animals and then there was a list of humans. So they had to differentiate humans from animals. So they call them Adam, but only when they're compared to something else. If the word Adam just appears on its own, like as in the laws of ohel, then it's enough. Then it's only Jews. If it comes to contrast with something else, then it can be referring to Gentiles as well. Asher, next pasuk, which is going to contradict. Asher yesh ba harbe mishtem-esrei ribo Adam, asher lo yada ben yimino l'smolo. Okay, this is a verse also in, this is a verse in Yonah. It says at the end of Sefer Yonah, when Yonah gets upset about the whole thing, and he says, God gets upset, and God says to Yonah, you think I'm not going to have pity on Nineveh that has 12 ribo, right, which is 1,200,000, I think, right, ribo is 110,000, it's sheshmel ribo, 600,000, right? I think it's 12,000. Anyway, I always get a little confused about the numbers. Anyway, so there it says they have a ton of people in the city. Of course, I'm going to have pity on them, God says. So now they say, again, it said this many people and a lot of animals. So it was comparing humans to animals, and that's why it said. Next verse. Now, wait a minute. If we say that Gentiles do not cause tuma't in an ohel, then why at the end of the battle with the Midianites were the people told, again, this is in Bamidbar, chapter 31, in verse 19, it says, right, you have to stay out of the camp for 7 days. Anyone who killed someone who came in contact with one of the dead people, and weren't the dead people Gentiles? So here you see, there clearly is laws of impurity. So, number one, answer, Dilma iktal chad yisrael. Maybe there was one Jew that was killed. Could be some Jew was killed. And that's what it's referring to. V'Rabbanan, the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and think there is tumah, what would they say? Lo nifkad mimenu ish. It says, we didn't lose a single person there, it says. So if it says we didn't lose a single person, clearly no one died. And that's why it's clear Gentiles do have tuma't ohel. That's the people who disagree with Rabbi Shimon by Yochai. But Rabbi Shimon Yochai, how's he going to deal with that pasuk? Lo nifka mimenu ish. What's that for? La avera. That means no one turned away and sinned because they were in contact with the Midianites. Maybe slept with their women or something like that. No, there were no sinning going on here. There was no sinning going on. Ravina Amar. Here's a different answer. Wait a minute. There's all different types of impurity. Adam kimu ba'ohel is specifically talking about impurity for dead people that works by tent, right? By airspace that's covered, and then it creates a tent. But if you touch a dead body or you carry a dead body, well, then you're going to be tameh, even if it's a Gentile. That's not what Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was referring to. So therefore, we could say that the pasuk there that talked about the tuma't mate, it was talking about people who would come in contact with a dead body, not the people who were underneath a covering where there was a dead body underneath. So that resolves the question in two different ways. Next, Mishnah. Somebody betroths a widow and then gets appointed to be the kohen gadol, the high priest. So in other words, when they did the kiddushin, the betrothal with the widow, they were not a kohen gadol. So there was nothing wrong with it. Now they're already betrothed. What's going to happen with the marriage? They're not allowed to marry an almana, a widow. So the Mishnah says, yichnos, you're allowed to, in this case, since the kiddushin was done in a way that was permitted, you're allowed to continue and marry her. Not only do they say this, but they're going to bring a case where it actually happened. Yoshua ben Gamla, shekidesh Marta Baitus, now kohen gadol. There was a case of Yoshua ben Gamla, the betrothed Marta Baitus, and the king appointed him to be the kohen gadol after the betrothal before the marriage. And he went and he married her. So there's your proof. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when we get to the Gemara. In fact, Shuli Mishkan in Flashback this week has a whole article about it. It's a very fascinating case for many different reasons, which we'll get to a little bit more when we get to the Gemara. Second part of the Mishnah, Shomeret Yabam shenafla lefnei kohen idiot v'nitmana liot kohen gadol. Now, Shomeret Yabam, someone whose husband died, that means she's by nature a widow. She falls to her brother-in-law, who's a kohen, right, for yibum, who's a kohen. Then, before he marries her, right, does yibum, nitmana liot kohen gadol, it becomes a kohen gadol. Even if he did maamar with her, now you would think he can marry her based on the first part of the Mishnah. No. You can't marry her. Okay? He's not allowed to. We're going to have to see in the Gemara why the difference between yibum and marriage. Tanu Rabbanit. So the Gemara quotes a Baitus that says, had exactly the source for our Mishnah, right? It's very common what the Gemara does. They bring Baitus that give the source because the Mishnah doesn't often give the source. So how do you know that you can marry her? It says, zona right? A kohen gadol can't marry a widow, a divorcee, chalala, or a zona can't marry them. Only a virgin woman from his nation can he take a woman. Now, he could have just said yikach. You already know they're women. Why does it say isha? It must be coming to add some other women, since the pasuk is talking about the women he can marry. It must be including some additional, and that means even, right, as long as she was betrothed before he was kohen gadol, now we can actually marry her even though she's a widow. Well, then why don't we include the shomeret yavam as well? Why the difference? Isha v'lo yevama. Most people say because it says isha in singular form, it's adding only one case and not two. Now, even though yevama is, for all intents and purposes, his wife, but she's a yevama and not a woman, right? Not his wife. So therefore, we're going to exclude her from the situation. Yoshua ben Gamla. So now it said, Sheminuhu hamelech liot kohen gadol. Normally, the king wasn't the one who appointed the kohen gadol. It was usually the Sanhedrin. There's a group that was in charge. But here it seems to say that the kohen did it. The king did it. Minuhu in nitmanalo. It sounds like he wasn't appointed. It was like a presidential appointee, right? As opposed to being voted in. So Amar Rav Yosef, right? Then they're saying that seems strange. That's not normally the way the kohen gadol was chosen. Rav Yosef says, Katir kachazina hachi. I see some sort of bad misdoing here. Something wasn't done properly. Tirkav is a measurement of dinarim, like a huge Think of coins. Marta Baitus paid off Yanai Malka, Yanai the king. Many people say this in the Yanai the Cheshmon and king. It must be somebody else. Until he was willing to make him the Kohen Gadol, meaning he bought his way into the Kahuna. We know that at the end of the Second Temple period, this was very common, that Kohanim bought their way in to become Kohanim Gadolim. This definitely puts Rabbi Shimon and Gamla in a weak light, right? He doesn't, that's actually not Rabbi Yehoshua and Gamla, puts him in a bad, doesn't look very good. There's a lot of questions asked about this. First of all, the Yerushalmi gives a different version of the story, that he basically, I might be giving away what's in flashback, but anyway, I'm sure there's a lot more to add there, but I didn't have a chance to read it before I taught the class. It wasn't up yet. But the point is that Yehoshua ben Gamla, according to the Yerushalmi, there was a different version that he basically, it's evading me for a minute. The story was, oh no, I totally forgot it. One second. Let me look at my, I'll refresh my memory for a second. I got distracted and now can't remember. Yeah, so I can't find it now. Yeah, right. He created a rumor that he was betrothed to Marta Baitus. She didn't really want to marry him, but he created a rumor, and then nobody would marry her. And then it was all a ploy to get himself to be the Kohen Gadol. He wanted to be with her because she was a wealthy woman, and he knew she would buy his way into the Kohen Gadol. And then once no one would marry her, she needed a divorce from him. Well, to get a divorce, they needed to be married. So once they got married, then basically, or betrothed, then she helped him, and then he ended up getting the Kahuna Agdola. So that's an interesting version, which really puts him in a negative light. The issue is that there's stories that talk about Yehoshua ben Gamla in a very positive way. They helped spread Torah, and there were good things about him. So the question is, are these two different people maybe with the same name? Was it that he became better later in life? Or was it that he was a good guy to begin with, he just didn't deserve the Kahuna Agdola? And then he just bought his way to buy the Kahuna Agdola. Now, obviously, the Yerushalmi puts him in a negative light, so it'd be hard to say he was really a good guy, but you never know. Anyway, a lot to be said there and a lot of different opinions. What I'm saying is quotes from different opinions that exist that are out there. Okay, in the meantime, let's move on. Kohen Gadol shemet achiv, we're a new Mishnah now. A Kohen Gadol whose brother dies. So that means, right, he dies without children, we're talking about, because we're in Yevamot. And he now is supposed to marry a widow, but he can't marry a widow because he's a Kohen Gadol. Can't marry widows. So choletz v'lo miyaben. He does chalitza, not yibum. So the Mishnah, the Gemara says, kapasik betane. It said it very simply, and it didn't distinguish between cases. Now, what are the two possible cases? Well, lo shnam mina erusin, lo shnam mina nisuin. It doesn't matter if she was betrothed to the first husband or not, or married already to the first husband. Now, why would you think there would be a difference? Well, bishlam mina nisuin, if she was married to the first husband, then that means that she is not only a widow, she's also be'ula. If you remember, by the Kohen Gadol, he has two things. He has a lo taseh, don't marry a widow, as I read before, and Isha betula, he has to marry, right? Ki im betula me'ama b'ikach isha. Positive commandment to specifically marry a virgin. So now, if the almanah was only engaged, she's actually still a virgin. But if she was married, she's not a virgin anymore. So from Nisuin, we understand, because there's an aseh and a lo taseh. There's the positive to marry a virgin, and a negative, don't marry a widow. And that, right, you can't have an aseh. You can't have a positive commandment of yibum override a positive and a negative. But the aseh of yibum should override the lo taseh of don't marry a widow, because she is still a betula. So there's only one aseh to dochet the lo taseh, and that should work. So they say gzera bi'ah rishona achu bi'ah shniya. We're worried because he's allowed to be with her the first time, but then he's not allowed to have relations with her the second time. He can do it just to fulfill the mitzvah of yibum. Once the mitzvah is done, he can't actually be with her anymore because he has to be with a woman who was a betula, or wasn't an almanah, really. She wasn't a widow. And this woman is a widow. He can't stay married to her. So therefore, they don't permit the first time so that you don't come to continue, right? Theoretically, I guess it means he would have to divorce her right away. Kohen, new Mishnah. Kohen hagiot lo yisa aylonit, elim ken yesh lo isha ubanim. A regular Kohen can't marry a woman who can't, we've learned this aylonit, it's a woman who never matures, her body never matures unless he has a wife and children, because otherwise he will never end up having children. And we're going to get to this, why specifically only kohen hedyot. Everybody has the mitzvah to have children. And in fact, we're going to get to the famous Mishnah today, Shamai B'Hil, about how many children one needs to have. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, lo yisa aylonit. Even if he has a wife and children, a kohen can never marry an aylonit. Why? Shehi zona ha'mura b'Torah. Because when the Torah says a zona, and today we're going to see a number of different interpretations for what a zona is, kohen cannot marry a zona. We've already said zona usually means prostitute, but clearly not in this context. So, question is, or not necessarily in this context. We'll see. Maybe some of the opinions, yes, but most of the opinions think it's more than just a woman who's a prostitute. So he says it includes a woman who can't bear children. Okay, where he's going to get this from, we're going to have to see later. Now, let's start with the end. That's the easiest. Bilat znut is, right, someone who was in a relationship with a man that was forbidden to her, like a daughter and her father. Okay, if she did that, she's considered a zona. That means someone who did something pretty wrong. There's a debate whether we mean only chayve kritut, the more severe ones, or even the chayve lavin. Anyone like that is called a zona. But he also adds a gioret and meshucheret, who are people who lived a different lifestyle before, let's say, right? They were Gentile or slaves. Slaves in general were betrothed often or designated, as we learned in Shifcha Charufa, to an Eved Ivri. So she had relations with a slave, a Jewish slave before, or maybe other people, we don't know. And a gioret is someone who before she became Jewish, we don't know, right? She could have been in relationships with other people. We already learned that before. So because of that, now none of these were prohibited to them. There was no prohibition on them to be with these people. So it's not like the same as the bilat znut, which is something really they did wrong. But the fact is, since they've had relations with other people in this kind of way, like a shifcha with an eved, which is not a normal marriage relationship, or a gioret with some Gentile, right, before she was converted with a Gentile man. So we're going to basically say that, right, again, when we talk about kohen having a certain status, that disqualifies her from marrying a kohen. That's the rabbi's approach. So now we're going to start in the Gemara. Amar le Reish Galuta le Rav Huna. The exilarch said to Rav Huna, my time, what's the reason for this kohen idiot? And I'm going to ask you furthermore, right? I kind of know the reason, but it's not going to make so much sense here because Mishum Piria Rivia, right? You're going to say it's because they need to have children. A Piria Rivia Kohanim would be Yisrael, lo mepakte. What, Jews, all Yisraelim aren't commanded? Why specifically only Kohanim can't marry an aylonit? So Amrle Mishum de Kabbalah bit Nasefa. In other words, yes, you're right. It applies to Yisraelim as well. But what's the issue? They wanted to bring up the end of the mission, the continuation. The next line was Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Afal Pishesh Lo Isha, moving out Amud Bet, even though he has a wife, V'yesh Lo Banim, Lo Yisa Aylonit Shizona Mu'ah B'Torah. He specifically said you can't marry an aylonit at all. Any kohen can't ever, even if he has another wife and children. Because for that, a regular Israel is allowed to marry a zona. He's not prohibited from marrying her, but this kohen is prohibited. So that's why we say because we want to bring Rabbi Yehuda, specifically it refers to a kohen, whereas a regular Israel can't marry her if he doesn't have children, because he needs to have children. But a kohen can't marry her even if he has children already and another wife. And therefore, mishum hachi ketana kohen. That's why it started out with kohen. Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna now comes and brings us the reason for Rabbi Yehuda. Why does he think this is a zona? My tamed Rabbi Yehuda dichtiv. He learns it from a pasuk in Hosea. It says there, achlu v'lo yispal. People will eat and they won't be satiated. His nu v'lo yiflotzu. They'll have znut, okay, which we don't know yet what that is. V'lo yiflotzu, meaning they'll have relations with women, but they won't have children. The floats, right? To go outward, to have lots of children. So, what do you see here? Any relationship that's not going to eventually lead to children is a bilat znut. Obviously, you have to take this with a grain of salt, right? It doesn't mean, you shouldn't be in a relationship where you're not having children. What about birth control? What about people who are older who get remarried, right? Obviously, they mean this in a particular context of someone who could still have children, who's in that stage, who maybe hasn't had yet, all different kinds of ways of getting around this. But basically, that's his statement. And also, by the way, we don't hold like Rabbi Yehuda. So anyway, his approach is, by the way, liznot often means to steer off the path. Okay, so it also is another explanation. Right, where did Rashi said it? I just want to find it. 1 minute. All right, we're going to get to that in a minute. Okay, sorry, I jumped the gun. Next, so that's the explanation for Yehuda from this pasuk in Hosea. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer kohen lo yisa ketana. Now we're going to learn about this halacha. From now, this is going to take us until the Mishnah at the very bottom of the page, which is Rabbi Eliezer makes this statement: a kohen can't marry a young woman. Okay, someone who's under a minor. We need to explain this and understand it. We're going to have some questions on it, and then we're going to bring 5 different explanations. The first 2 will be rejected. The last 3 will be possibilities. Amalei Rav Chisda l'Rabba. Pok ayemba. Rav Chisda tells Rabba, go look into this halacha and understand it well, because or tabayale Rav Huna minach. Okay, in the evening, Rav Huna is going to come and quiz you about this, so you better know your stuff. Nafik yemba. He went and looked into it, and he said the following. What could this be based on? Rabbi Eliezer sever like Rabbi Meir v'sever like Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, he held like Rabbi Meir and he held like Rabbi Yehuda. Sever like Rabbi Meir. Now we don't yet know who Rabbi Yehuda is and who Rabbi Meir is. Rabbi Yehuda we know, although we're going to have to see how this connects. Sever like Rabbi Meir dechayish l'miuta. Sever like Rabbi Yehuda damar aylonit zona havya. What is Rabbi Meir? Okay, let's start with Rabbi Yehuda. He holds that an aylonit is prohibited to a kohen. Now, why can't you marry a ketana then? Because maybe the ketana will grow up to be an aylonit. Maybe she'll never physically mature. If that's the case, well, then you were never allowed to marry her in the first place. So, because it turns out she was a zona. So in order to avoid that, Rabbi Meir is the one who's always concerned for minority, meaning most women are not ayloniot. So most rabbis hold, just go by the majority. You can assume she's not an aylonit. Rabbi Meir, we've seen this a bunch of times, is always worried for what if. Maybe there's a small chance she's an aylonit, so wait. Don't marry her when she's young. And that's what this halacha of Rabbi Eliezer is telling you. What's the problem? It's Rabbi Eliezer. Now we're going to prove right now that Rabbi Eliezer doesn't hold like Rabbi Meir, that he's worried about a minority case, a minority possibility in some other sugya. And he doesn't hold like Rabbi Yehuda either, that a zona is an aylonit. So this is going to be a very bad option of an explanation. Okay. Rabbi Meir misarala. Does he really hold like Rabbi Meir? Tanya doesn't say in the Baitus, katan uktana lo chotzim v'lo miyabmim. A katan and ketana can never do chalitza or yibum. You have to wait. Tivrei Rabbi Meir. You have to wait until they get older, because maybe they'll be an aylonit and they'll be exempt from the whole thing. So Amrulo the Rabbi Meir. Yafeh Marta. Now we're going to see why. Yafeh Marta she'en chotzim. En chotzim is not because of that. En chotzim is for a different reason. Ish k'tiv parasha. It says im lo yachpotza ish lakachat et yivimto. So he has to be an ish. He has to be gadol. That we learn chalitza directly from the pasuk. Umakshina nisha leish. And then we say, well, the woman is next to the husband. You know, we're talking about the woman in the context of this man. Well, we'll say the same thing is true for her. Ella, my time at imi yabmim. So why not imi yabmim? Amarlei katan shemi yimatzah saris, ketana shema timatzeh aylonit. Maybe the katan will end up being a saris, right, where he doesn't have the ability to have children. Or the ketana, shema timatzeh aylonit, maybe she won't have the opportunity, right? She won't be able to have children. So now, basically, that's Rabbi Meir, okay? Now, what's the main problem? If they do yibum, that means they're going to get married to each other. And it turns out they weren't allowed to get married to each other. And it turns out it goes back to Eshet Ach, to his brother's wife, who's never allowed to marry. So we definitely want to avoid that according to Rabbi Meir. Vitanya. Now, what's the issue? We want to see what Rabbi Eliezer says about this. Well, there's a Beit about the same thing that says, she can't do divrei Rabbi Eliezer. She can't do chalitza, as we said from the pasuk, but yibum she could do, because we're not worried on the off chance that she's an aylonit. So we see here he's not worried about Rabbi Meir for the miuta. And furthermore, to Rabbi Yehuda misvirale, well, he doesn't know like Rabbi Yehuda either, because vahatanya zona kishma divrei Rabbi Eliezer. We have a Beit where it's defining zona, and now we're going to see all the different opinions about what a zona is. Rabbi Eliezer is the first opinion. It says zona kishma. What is kishma? This is where I was referring to Rashi before. Rashi, about 10 lines from the top of the page, says kishma lashon to'ah. Zona is lit'ot, to go the wrong way. So what is to'ah? To'ah mitacha ba'ala la'achirim. She's married and she goes and, goes off with somebody else. That Rashi says eshet ish. According to Rashi, zona is not even what you would call a prostitute nowadays. It's a woman who's married and goes and sleeps with somebody else. That's a zona. Ooh, so now we see clearly doesn't hold like it. So we're going to basically reject this first opinion, but we're already in this Beit. We're going to see all the different opinions about a zona. Some of them we already know, some of them will be new. Next, Rabbi Akiva Amar, zona zo mufkeret. This is a woman, she could be not a married woman, but she is mufkeret, she's hefker. She lets her body be taken by all sorts of men. Okay, she sleeps around, as we would say. Raji even points out that if it's just one time, that wouldn't be counted as hefkerut. Okay, it would have to be multiple times. Rabbi Mati ben Charash omer, afilu halach ba'ala lahashtota u'ba'a leha baderech asa zona. It could even be within marriage. Like what? If someone accuses his wife of being a sota and he takes her to the temple, on the way to the temple, he ends up sleeping with her, that is forbidden to do. And that is even called a zona. Next, so there was 3 opinions. Opinion number 4, Rabbi Yehuda Omer zona zo aylonit, that we saw. Chachamim omri ein zona legior d'meshukeret b'shenabala b'ilatznut, that we saw in the Mishnah as well. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, it should be Rabbi Eliezer because we already have Rabbi Eliezer. He's the 6th opinion. Panoi habal pnuya shelo l'shem ishut asa zona. A man and woman who have a relationship together outside of marriage. Okay, it sounds like one be'ilah. This goes against what we saw before about the mufkeret. One act of intercourse between a man and a woman outside of marriage, right, where they weren't married, they could both be single, right? Even that is going to be considered a zona. So now we'll get back to this later. We don't hold this way, but we'll get back to this later. This would create a lot of complication for kohanim if they couldn't marry a woman who had engaged in sexual relations before marriage, right? That would be difficult. Okay. Ella, because then you'd have to, why would it be difficult? Because you'd have to start asking everybody, right? It would be, I mean, the question is how far do you have to go to ask people, but theoretically, there could be a lot of people under suspicion that maybe that had happened. Okay, now, Ella Amar of Adabar Ava. So, explanation number 2, why a kohen can't marry a ketana, a minor. Amar of Adabar Ava, Hacha be kohen gadol askinan. It's only talking about a kohen gadol. Now, why? Le'emat kanela. Well, what's the issue? If he marries a ketana, when did he really acquire her? He acquires her at the moment of when she gets older, because nisuin is through consummating the marriage, through intercourse. That can only be when she's of age, she has dat. Okay, so then le'emat kanela l'chigadla. But once she's, now what's the problem? When he acquires her, she's already be'ulai. She's already, we assume he had relations with her beforehand because they've been married for a while. Even though she's a minor, you can have relations with a minor. And now, only when she becomes of age, is the marriage going to actually really take place. And turns out he's now marrying a be'ula. Now, it's obviously someone who would have relations with him, but that doesn't matter. He's not allowed to marry someone who's had relations already. So that's his answer. So, Amarava, Michale Lev, what? It's kind of like saying, where are your brains, right? What are you saying? That's totally not true. Why? If her father did the betrothal, remember, we learned the father can betroth her, and she's betrothed already at that point. So that's way back before the moment she becomes older. If she did it herself, well, then you're right. She wouldn't be till later, but then this wouldn't only be Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Rabbi Eliezer, even the rabbis would agree about that. So it doesn't make sense to explain Rabbi Eliezer's opinion here about a kohen can't marry a ketana. Is about a kohen gadol who marries her because right when she's young. And that's the problem, because then everyone would agree if she married herself, she betrothed herself to him, it certainly wouldn't be relevant till later. And at that point, she's already had relations. She's not a virgin. So third option. We're talking about a regular kohen. This is a very strange thing, but I guess it fits in maybe with something we said about a girl being 3 and a day. And we tried to give some explanations how they could talk about that way. And we suggested that maybe it was a way to protect younger women, because younger women can't really protect themselves from men who are trying to have relations with them, right? Who might attack them or something. So what do we say? If a kohen gadol, now we're talking about, regular kohen, shouldn't be with a woman who's with somebody else. Now, if she's young, there's a concern that someone else might take advantage of her one day when the husband's not around, and she won't know what to do because she's too young to fight back for herself. And therefore, we don't want him to do that, because then it'll end up she's with some other man while she's married to him. So then they say, wait a minute, if ihachi Yisrael nami, right? Well, that should be a problem for Yisrael also. If his wife is an ish is with him and then was with someone else, it should be a problem for anyone to marry a young woman. So they say, well, pituyek tana onesu. Even if she agrees to it, consensual, it's not consensual. It's considered rape. Anything underage, right here again, you see the rabbis had a good understanding of this, that any young woman who agrees to do something like that is not doing it really of her own her own will. And therefore, ones yisrael mishra shari. Remember, the husband can be with his wife if she was raped by someone else, only not if he's a kohen, because a kohen has this higher status where he can't be with a woman who is raped. That's why they don't allow regular kohen to marry. So he says regular kohen, and the concern is this. Explanation number 4, which is really only explanation number 2, because the first 2 we rejected, of Papa Amar Kohen Gadol. And it goes according to, so he's back to saying it's really only Kohen Gadol. Vehai Tanahu, de Tanya. It goes by this Tana's opinion, betula. Because it says he has to marry betula, it sounds like a betula. Usually you think of someone very young. The whole ketana sounds like she could be ketana. But then it says Tamalomar Isha. It also says a woman. We saw that before. Isha bogeret. Sounds like someone more of age. So how do we say this? How does this work? Right? Talmud lomar betula. To say no, not a bogeret, not an older woman. So haketzad. This is what the halacha calls a ne'ara. It's usually from age 12 to 12 and 6 months. Now you're going to see if you're a kohen gadol, your pool is very narrow as to who you can marry. She has to be a very particular age, according to this opinion. And that's why he can't marry ketana, because Torah, from the drashot of the Torah, we can infer he has to marry someone young. The last answer is going to be very similar, except that it darshans it a little bit differently. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Hi Tana, it goes by this Tana. The Tanya betula, ein betula ela na'ara. Betula always means na'ara. That's what a betula is. It's this young woman. Same thing, just learning it out from the word betula alone. V'cheinu omer, how do we know this? Hana'ara tovat mar'eh me'od betula. The woman, who is this? This is Rivka. When they found Rivka, Eliezer says, the na'ara is tovat mar'eh me'od. She's a betula. Here you see she's a na'ara, and she's called a betula. So she must have been this age of 12. Okay, now what about the midrash that Rashi quotes that everybody loves to quote? That Rivka was 3. Well, this clearly disagrees with it. This is the less known midrash because Rashi didn't quote it there, that she was actually 12. So for all those who struggle with that midrash, as did Rambam, and says that midrash was never meant to be understood literally, here's a different approach that says she was actually 12 years old. I don't know if that makes it much better. We don't really view 12 as marriageable age at this point, but those days it definitely was more so than 3. Okay. Last line of the Mishnah before we get to relate to in this Mishnah, before we jump to the next Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Panoi Habala Pnuya Shelo L'Shem Shut Asa'a Zona, and Amar of Amram Ein Halacha Ki Rabbi Eliezer. They say we don't hold like Rabbi Eliezer that if a woman and a man have a sexual relationship, an interaction before marriage, sounds like on a one-off or something like that. It's not so clear more, but it wasn't for the purposes of marriage. That doesn't make her into a zona. It's forbidden to marry a kohen. Okay, Mishnah. Lo yibatel adam, very, very famous Mishnah, mipirya urivya elim ken yesh lo banim. You can't not engage in having children unless you already have children. Beit Shamai omrim. So how many children is children? Beit Shamai said, shnei zacharim, 2 males. Beit Hillel omrim zachar u'nekeva, male and female. We'll see later in the Gemara and tomorrow's Shiur where they get it from. There's a debate. First of all, Beit Hillel already said, shneimar zachar u'nekeva b'ra'am, as the world was created. God created man and woman. Likewise, everyone else should do that in their house. Obviously, not everyone can do that. Sometimes you just end up with a lot of girls or a lot of boys or something like that. But the question is, what's the fulfillment of the mitzvah? Some people say that they agree, right? Forgetting about, obviously, people who can't have children at all, who try and can't, right? Obviously, there's a lot more to this Mishnah than what it says, right? It seems to describe this idyllic, like I can just choose, number 1, to be able to conceive, number 2, right, to be able to give birth, number 3, to be able to decide whether I can have 2 boys or a boy and a girl, right? That's a whole separate issue, right, which isn't addressed right here directly. The other thing to note is that some of the commentaries think that when Beit Hillel says boy and girl, he means boy and girl or 2 boys. Or alternatively, some people say when Beit Shammai says 2 boys, he means 2 boys or a boy and girl. So there's different ways to understand them. Obviously, one of them can only say one and the other one says both. Who says what is a debate. So now the Gemara says, Hayesh lo banim mipriya rivya batil me'isha lo batil. They make a certain inference. Only relating to priya rivya. It's not saying once you finish having children, you should divorce your wife. You're done with that, move on. So, Messiah Rav Nachman Shmuel, this seems to support Rav Nachman in the name of Shmuel. Damar, he actually views it as a prohibition to be without a wife. Because it says in Sefer Breshit, you shouldn't be alone. He takes that seriously. So therefore, you have to always have a wife. Some people say, no, let's read the Mishnah differently. You can get divorced if you want from your wife after that. You don't need to stay married. There is no special mitzvah here. In which case, that seemed to contradict to Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel, right? Because he said you have to stay married. So, we can explain it like this. If he doesn't have children, he should marry a wife who can bring him children. If he already does, and that's what it means. It just means you should marry a woman who can give you children only if you don't have children. If you already have children, you can marry someone who can't bear you children. Nafkamina, what's the nafkamina? Limkor Sefer Torah b'shvil banim. This is very interesting. We learned this in Megillah that you can sell a Sefer Torah only for certain things. One of them is to marry a woman. The question is it to marry a woman in order to have children, or is it a mitzvah in and of itself just to marry children, to marry a woman? Not right, and therefore you'd be able to sell a Sefer Torah just to marry a woman, even if you already have children. So that's an interesting nafkamina, how important it is, and the value of marriage, right? Where when it's not a marriage, that's meant to bring you children. Interesting machloket. We'll get into more of this in tomorrow's daf about the machloket. We'll start from the bottom here tomorrow about the basis of the machloket, Beit Shamai and Beit Hillel. Have a Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov.